Hey there folks, Zane from the Infinite Jukebox here with another album review, and today I wanted to talk about the new MGMT record, Loss of Life. MGMT and their evolution from a product of the 2000 indie boom to one of the most enduring semi-experimental pop artists within the realm of music as a whole is an interesting one to follow when you consider how much extremely uneven terrain they've had to traverse to get to where they are today. I mean, 2008's Oracular Spectacular, their debut studio album, was well received publicly, fairly well received critically, and produced some major hits that still manage to have extreme amounts of airplay today. Songs like Kids and Time to Pretend. But at the end of the day, MGMT weren't really vibing with that critical and commercial success exactly. They wanted the critical success from a different perspective, and they wanted the commercial success in, well, really no way at all, which kind of showed when they released their sophomore studio album, 2010's Congratulations, a now fan-favorite record that at the time was very polarizing with its embrace of deeply psychedelic tones and some stoner-adjacent surf rock influences, among other things, thus leaving their reaction from the general public and their reaction from critics to be mixed, to say the least, again, despite the fact that said album is now significantly more well-liked than it was 14 years ago. The generally poorly received third studio album from MGMT, 2013's self-titled album, could have honestly marked a bit of a flash-in-the-pan status for them. You gotta think this was around the same time that some of their indie peers like Foxygen and Foster the People, among other once big names within mainstream alternative music, were kind of starting to fade out after one, maybe two at most big hits. But then 2018 rolled along, and MGMT dropped Little Dark Age, and honestly, it was insane. Look, Little Dark Age isn't even one of my favorite albums or anything like that, but it's just baffling how much of a comeback they managed to have there, with songs like the title track and Mia Michael managing to nearly outshine some of the big hits they had found themselves having nearly a decade prior, and completely unintentionally at that, with a number of tracks on that record being pretty inaccessible in comparison to a lot of mainstream pop music from the same year. But nonetheless, if you use social media at all and you haven't heard the title track in various formats a million times by now, then I genuinely do not believe you are a real human being. So, Little Dark Age, with smash hits that were so viral that they very nearly outshined the big mainstream hits they had acquired a decade prior, there was definitely some hype for whatever would follow that up. I mean, Little Dark Age, even besides being popular, was an incredibly impressive, creative piece of work from a duo that were seemingly refusing to ever back down from whatever they wanted to do. And now, here we are, 6 years after that record, with Loss of Life, MGMT's latest studio album, and I really can't help but feel that this is just a touch underwhelming. Loss of Life just kind of feels like a missed opportunity for Andrew VanWyngarden and Ben Goldwasser to further demonstrate the unrelenting, uncompromised creative ability that they've been building up since practically the beginning of their career, as they have consistently rejected the notion of mainstream commercial success. Loss of Life often feels more like a bittersweet collage of the various artistic avenues that MGMT have gone down throughout their entire existence more than anything else, and I mean, I get it. At this point in their career, MGMT are one poorly received album away from being deemed a legacy indie act, and really having their new releases get minimal attention at best while people focus on the classics. So I can certainly see why they would want to go for a variety of sounds that they've already toyed with in the past to varying extents, and as the years go on and the continuously revolving door of relevant artists continues to spin, I feel like this should be some sort of career-defining achievement, some sort of record that really just defines their legacy up to this point, a collection of all of the good qualities about them as a duo, and I just don't feel it. While everything does flow smoothly from track to track, which is something that I can always appreciate, it does kind of feel like a lot of the songs here are trying just a touch too hard to really tug at the heartstrings of the listener and get an emotional rise out of them, and that goes just as much for the folksy Nothing to Declare as it does the much more lush and heavily pop-oriented I Wish I Was Joking. These are just tracks that I feel like are trying to be so emotional that they almost kind of cancel themselves out to an extent, especially when they make up the vast majority of the record. In that way, Loss of Life kind of feels like it's constantly tripping over its own 2 feet here. I mean, that's not necessarily to say that this album is super repetitive or anything like that. It certainly isn't. In fact, it's anything but. But at the same time, every song wants to drown the listener in this sea of perceived nostalgia, yet it kind of feels like MGMT don't really know how they want to go about doing that. I mean, there's nothing wrong with making a melancholic, bittersweet, hopeful, yet depressing record. That's totally fine. There are countless records like that are phenomenal, but the common thread between any album like that succeeds in what it does is it has a specific way in executing that feeling, and it sort of feels like Andrew VanWyngarden and Ben Goldwasser don't really know how they want to execute that, again, semi-nostalgic feel that is here throughout the album. I wouldn't necessarily say this is a sort of see what sticks kind of experiment or anything like that. In fact, this is probably the least experimental MGMT have been in a good while. But at the same time, it does kind of feel like the duo just taking a bunch of different sounds at different points of their career, primarily from the Little Dark Age era, as well as some stuff from their self-titled album and Congratulations era, and just putting it together in a way that feels not necessarily haphazard, but nonetheless still just a little bit forced, with slight tweaks to certain sounds here or there, ultimately resulting in an album that, despite being consistent in terms of flow, sort of just feels like it's trying to get you to be emotional in some manner, and because of that, it just doesn't really work that way. It's not so much that it's a retrospective of MGMT's career up to this point, which would be fine. It feels much more like it's intentionally trying to make you feel like it is, and because of that, it can't really be an honest version of itself. I think that especially shows when you see how quickly this album drops off in quality, too. The first proper, full-length, fully fleshed-out song on the album is the track Mother Nature, which is an excellent song. I actually had high hopes for this album because of the fact that that single song is as strong as it is. It's not among their best, but I still think it's a very pretty song. I think it's written extraordinarily well. I think that VanWyngarden's vocals are very nice on it, etc., etc. There's a lot of positive things I could say about that song, and it's a deeply emotional cut to boot. However, when you immediately follow that up with several more songs that are trying to get the exact same reaction out of the listener, or at least how I perceive them as trying to get the same or similar emotional reactions out of the listener, it loses its luster pretty quickly, and it ultimately results in something that feels a bit monotonous at times, even if the general instrumentation or vibe of these songs is switched up slightly from song to song. In fact, I would actually argue that this album, Loss of Life, is the least MGMT that MGMT have felt in quite some time. And I know that's bizarre to say, considering this is a duo that's constantly taking on new sounds, new styles, new sonic aesthetics, constantly evolving, but just hear me out on this one. While it is true that if MGMT weren't always a consistently experimental and adventurous band, they would still be making songs like Time to Pretend today and never become quite the controversial act that they eventually did, I still do feel that Loss of Life is a bit of a remarkably limp evolution from its predecessor, Little Dark Age. And that's not necessarily to compare the two, that's just to say that this album feels like it wants to expand upon a lot of the sounds on that record, and ultimately fails to even match them, let alone grow. Whereas previous albums have seen MGMT venture into the realms of psychedelia with heavy melodic focus on a lot of songs, I kinda can't help but feel that a lot of that is lost here, despite the fact that it's obviously trying to be replicated to an extent. And more than that, I just don't really find there to be a ton of personality in a lot of the material on this record. For example, Bubblegum Dog's sort of stab at this kind of Roxy Music-esque glam rock doesn't have enough attitude or really just general charisma about it to really successfully convey its very abstract and honestly pretty questionable lyrics. That isn't to mention songs like Nothing Changes that are very self-indulgent and, despite being well performed, seemingly go nowhere and don't really leave the listener a ton to latch onto from a structural standpoint. There's also Dancing in Babylon, a Christine and the Queens collaboration that I just don't find all that memorable. It feels like overly restrained sort of sophistopop that has a lot of the makings of a wasted collaboration between two extremely talented artists. I think you get my point. The vast majority of the songs here have a lot of potential, or at least a couple of good traits, but ultimately there's just too much unmemorable moments. There's just too many passages that feel like they should be more distinct that aren't. There are too many qualities about a number of songs on this record that just feel like wasted opportunities in one form or another, and a number more of qualities on this record that just don't really have anything to say about them at all. Much of the record's atmospheric qualities are defined and determined by production choices that kind of leave the atmosphere here feeling more like a thin veil placed over just sort of fluffy electronic and pop rock rather than anything to really get lost in. And that's a shame because it means that the depths of the album here are ultimately very shallow, something that I don't think even in MGMT's weakest moments is something that I could ever realistically say about them. There's usually always something to really find, some sort of quality or some sort of emotional height within the average MGMT song that I think shines most of the time, even on their weakest tracks. And I can't say that about the vast majority of this record. There's just not much here in terms of actual soundscaping that I can really fall in love with. This could partly be chalked up to the influence of some outside producers that did work on this album. For example, you have Daniel Lopatin of One O Tricks Point Never fame, and his influence can definitely be felt in a couple of places here or there on this record. For example, his sound certainly influences the sort of minimalism dance fusion on the album closing title track in a way that kind of feels more just like an OPN song featuring MGMT than it does a full fleshed out song from the latter, ultimately resulting in kind of an awkward finish to an already fairly unimpressive album. And as a whole, I just kind of feel like this doesn't really represent what MGMT are best at doing. Thus, going back around to, as I stated before, this not really feeling like MGMT. It's not because they evolved into something that makes no sense. This is natural progression. It's just that they evolved into something that feels significantly less detailed, significantly less passionate, and generally just significantly less interesting than they've been in the past. Even with all of that being said, Andrew VanWyngarden and Ben Goldwasser are still at the heart of this project, and they are still two talented individuals. VanWyngarden's vocals in particular throughout this record are generally pretty strong. There are a couple of moments here or there where I would say that his vocals kind of trail off in terms of relevance or in terms of impact, especially in a couple of moments where I feel like maybe he should be a little more present, maybe just a little more punchy in terms of how his vocals are mixed, but even then, I still think that as a whole he delivers some really solid performances here. It's just a shame that the rest of the record can't really match up with that. There is this ever-looming feeling throughout Loss of Life that this is meant to be MGMT at their easiest to stomach musically and most striking from an emotional standpoint. And conceptually, that sounds perfectly fine. MGMT are not some sort of crazy experimental band that are so hard to get into. There's a reason why they've had multiple genuine mainstream hits. I mean, this isn't the Butthole Surfers. It's an easy band to get into. That being said, I do think they have a lot of idiosyncratic tendencies that they've shown off in a lot of their music, a lot of quirky qualities that have made them such a unique duo over the course of their careers, and I feel like a lot of that is lost here, thus relying on them just being fairly bittersweet and sentimental musically, and that just doesn't work for me here, especially when it's at such a constant rate and in such a less intriguing, less detailed way than what they've shown in the past, which, I mean, really, that's just a shame. Ultimately, I can't help but feel that Loss of Life is trying its best to be more digestible than its predecessor, Little Dark Age, which is in and of itself already a very easily accessible album, if I'm being completely honest. And that, to me, leads to a bit of a lack of creative identity here that I don't think I would say we've really seen from MGMT in quite a long time. While Andrew VanWyngarden and Ben Goldwasser are still beyond capable from an instrumental and performance standpoint, everything on Loss of Life feels significantly lesser than what they've shown themselves to be capable of in the past. I mean, The hooks and choruses don't really stick. The experimentation feels more heavily rooted in cycling through different sounds rather than expanding upon them. And even when the occasional solid vocal performance, solid lyric pops up, a lot of it just feels overshadowed by the one note sort of musical and sonic landscape that it ends up being placed in. MGMT's latest effort feels like it's constantly trying to find this balance between hope and melancholy, and the massive irony of that is that at the end of the day, it sort of feels like they don't really manage to achieve one or the other. Maybe this is the perfect balance that the album is seemingly looking for, but if that's true, then it doesn't manage to achieve either emotion in any sort of especially meaningful way, and that's a tragedy considering how much MGMT have managed to put out in the past that has been legitimately beautiful or moving in nature. I'm going to give this record 2.5 stars out of 5. And with that being said, that is the end of this album review. I've been Zane from the Infinite Jukebox. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.